this is kind of in addition to what we just talked about. We mentioned forms of anemia, right? And we said, we were talking about these lab markers, right? So MCV, what is that? That's mean corpuscular volume. Again, it's the size of the red blood cell. When the red blood cells are too big, as you see in this diagram here, those red blood cells are bigger than these red blood cells, okay? This is called macrocytic. Macro means too large. That means these red blood cells never properly matured, so they never got to the right size, okay? And then you have here, you have microcytic, meaning these blood cells, red blood cells, are too small. So generally with a microcytic anemia, whereas a macrocytic anemia typically is a B12 and a folate deficiency, and again, this is typical. A microcytic anemia is typically a iron, zinc, copper, or B6 deficiency, because those nutrients are necessary to form hemoglobin. Remember, inside that red blood cell, you have that protein hemoglobin. But if you're not forming enough hemoglobin, then the red blood cell is too small. That hemoglobin doesn't bulk up the cell, so the cell actually is microcytic. It's too small, and it's also hypochromic, meaning it's pale. The color of the cell itself is very pale because hemoglobin is a rich red color. And so the cell becomes too small and it becomes too pale, and doctors can test for these types of things, again, looking at markers like MCV and MCH and MCHC, etc., and can get an idea of whether or not that anemia is microcytic hypochromic, which would make us think more along the lines nutritionally of these nutrients, or whether that's a macrocytic anemia, which would make us think more along the lines of B vitamin deficiency. And then there's hemolytic anemias, and as I said before, these red blood, you can see these red blood cells, they break too easy. They break open, they break apart, and this is oftentimes accompanied by antioxidant problems. Antioxidant problems like vitamin C, vitamin E is an antioxidant, but also the membrane around your cell, that membrane needs omega-3 fats, and it also needs what's called oleic acid fat. Oleic acid is a type of fat. You get it from almonds and avocados, predominantly, and olive oil. But these fats strengthen cell membranes. And if you've got a deficiency of these fats, these membranes around the cells become too weak and they'll lyse prematurely. And that will lead to, with hemolytic anemia, generally we'll see jaundice. And if you don't know what jaundice is a yellow discoloration of the skin, and that's because there's a pigment inside of your red blood cells called bilirubin that will turn the skin yellow. So if your cells are breaking open too quickly, that pigment will build up into your skin, into the sclera of your eyes, and it will cause yellow discoloration. You'll see this, those of you who've had children may have experienced the baby having jaundice because their liver wasn't mature enough yet, and what was happening is that bilirubin built up in their skin, and that's why in the hospital with newborn babies they put them under these UV lights, because UV lights help to break down bilirubin appropriately. But we'll see jaundice in hemolytic anemia as a consequence. So if your skin is turning yellow, if somebody's saying, hey, why is your skin turning yellow? Why do you look more yellow? And why did the whites of your eyes, why are they turning yellow? You might suspect hemolytic anemia as a potential reason why that could be happening. Okay, so said before that gluten could definitely contribute to anemia, and this is one of the big ways, right? It's gluten-induced nutritional deficiencies. Now, I've hammered this home in a number of shows and a number of videos where we know gluten can cause malabsorption, gluten can cause damage to the intestinal lining, gluten can cause inflammation that causes your body to burn through more nutrients. But these are some of the main nutritional deficiencies that we know gluten definitely can cause that can also lead to anemia. So again, what do most doctors do? They focus only on iron and they forget about these other nutrients. They don't even measure, they don't do their diligence, right? It's because most doctors don't study nutrition. It's pretty rare to find a doctor who knows anything about nutrition because it's just not something that's taught in the curricula of most medical schools. So that being the case, they'll focus on the iron and they'll not look at any of these others, but you still may be anemic, just not iron deficiency anemic. So it's important to understand that measuring nutrition is very, very important. Now here's what some research studies show. Can going gluten-free prevent anemia? Or can it reverse anemia? Well, one study found that female celiac patients recovered, and we're talking about iron in this study, iron deficiency, is that in this research study, 78% of the women recovered from their anemia just by going gluten-free. They didn't supplement iron. They didn't have to eat, a pound of liver every day. They didn't have to do those things. They simply just had to get gluten out of the diet. When the gluten-induced gut damage stopped, their gut started to absorb the iron properly again, and it corrected their anemias. Now, there's 22%, though, that didn't get corrected. And that's part of the problem, is that lack of correction in that other 22% is because sometimes the damage is intense. Sometimes the damage is extensive, the GI damage, and it can take time for that to heal. And sometimes it requires supplementation to overcome. And it could be oral supplementation. In many cases, oral works just fine. Anywhere between 50 and 75 milligrams a day of iron, typically in an amino acid chelate, like a bisglycinate or something like that, is enough to get good supplementation without overdoing it. One of the problems with taking iron if you don't need it is it's oxidative, and iron can be very damaging. So it's important that you don't just go and take a bunch of iron without actually finding out whether or not iron deficiency is your problem. But the damage can be extensive. Supplementation can correct it. In some cases, you got to have transfusion. I mean, you got to get blood pumped into you to correct the anemia. I've seen this be the case, 20 years of my practice. I've seen this be the case a handful of times where people just weren't responsive to diet change because the damage was too extensive and supplementation wouldn't do it. So the transfusion kind of was the thing that got them over the hump. So, any one of these things could be important, but again, gluten can cause anemia, and going gluten-free can correct anemia. And again, in this research study, in the vast majority of the patients. So again, that's important to understand, because some people, they go to their doctor, and what they do is they find out they're anemic. And this is, let me go ahead. Well, let me make some room here. They go to their doctor, they find out they're anemic, get the right blood test, they're anemic. So now what? They're anemic. So the doctor recommends iron, and that's it. And then you take the iron, and you're still anemic. So then the doctor says, more iron. And you do that, and you're still anemic. Well, there's a name for this. It's called refractory anemia. The bigger question here is, taking more iron is not going to correct why you have an iron deficiency if your iron deficiency is being caused by damage to your gut's ability to absorb it, or internal bleeding, or something along those lines. Where iron will correct an anemia is if your diet is truly devoid of adequate quantities of iron to sustain adequate red blood cell and hemoglobin production. But iron by itself, if you have an iron deficiency, the next question out of your mouth to your doctor should be, why is my iron low? What are all the reasons why my iron is low? And can we investigate those reasons or those potential possibilities? Because again, this right here, anemia, for a huge percentage of gluten-sensitive individuals, is the only symptom they'll have. And it's this anemia that actually ultimately 20, 30 years down the road leads to the diagnosis of gluten sensitivity. You don't want to wait 20 or 30 years struggling with anemia, low energy, muscle pain, etc., to get a right answer. And this is why, if you've been diagnosed with anemia and your doctor just says, hey, just take iron and call me in the morning, you need to ask deeper questions. You need to say, well, why do I have the anemia? Is it nutritional? Can we measure my nutritional status? Could it be potentially that I have occult blood loss? Can we do a fecal occult blood test? Is it possible that I have an inflammatory bowel issue? Can we, maybe rule out inflammation within my gut as a potential reason as to malabsorption of iron? Because especially if you eat foods that contain iron, if you eat, red meat, if you eat if you eat liver, if you eat organ meats, you should be getting adequate iron within your diet. You don't need to mass dose iron to get adequate quantities, but generally where there's an iron deficiency anemia is because somebody has an underlying problem and it just hasn't been disclosed or discovered yet. So just make sure that you don't just start popping iron for the sake of popping iron without understanding why you have that deficit. Okay. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.